Hi, everyone, and welcome to this hour-long presentation. My name is Dr. Anil Bahal. I've been working in the field of qualitative research for many years now, and what I hope to share with you are some experiences that I've had personally. The reason I'm doing this is I'd like you to avoid some of the pitfalls and challenges that I encountered in my own journey. And hopefully, this hour-long presentation will provide you with a unique insight into what qualitative research is and what it entails, so that you can be better prepared to, to confront your own dissertations and to get the most out of the research years that you put into your doctoral work. With that said, let's go to the first slide. This is a citation from Dr. Michael G. Pratt from Boston College. And let's read this together. Because of the equifinality of writing and doing qualitative research, the lack of a boilerplate need not mean that the kingdom is lost. What is lost in structure is gained in the ability to be creative. Thus, one might replace a nail with superglue or other bonding agent. However, whatever you use, the burden is on you to make sure the adhesive adheres, i.e., your story coheres and the shoe holds tight. So, what the author is trying to caution us against is the notion that because qualitative research, as many of you already know, lacks the structure, lacks a boilerplate, lacks a set procedure on how to go about it, it can tend to become too abstract and too ephemeral, and also feels very tentative to new scholars. And especially those that have come from the quantitative realm, who are very used to having preset roadmaps on how to go about doing something. So it can be very challenging for someone that's not comfortable with the notion of uncertainty. Someone that's always looking for procedures and ways of going about stuff. So let's keep our minds open to what is going to emerge in this presentation. This is a bit unnatural for me. I usually do webinars and web conferencing with at least 30 or 40 doctoral students. But today I thought that I would give you a overview into this. So I decided to do this presentation for you. All right, let's go to the next slide. Qualitative research involves stories and narratives. So I often ask people that are going to be immersing themselves in qualitative research if they're comfortable with stories, narratives, anecdotes, episodes. And the reason for that is qualitative research, unlike quantitative research, has a lot of data. There's a tremendous amount of data that are generated from interviews. And as you well know, interviews are typically in-depth interviews, semi-structured in nature. You could also have case studies, you could have other narratives. And so what happens with this is there's a tremendous amount. The voluminous data can become very overwhelming to the novice scholar. So I ask this question: are you comfortable with your and others' pathos, i.e. deep emotions? You all heard of ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos meaning the ethics, pathos is deep emotions, and logos is the logic. So if you're not comfortable with holding your own emotions and the emotions of others, others meaning the participants who are going to tell you really involved stories, you should really consider going back to the drawing board, rethinking this whole strategy, your methodology, because qualitative research could get you into the weeds. and you may not find yourself too comfortable doing it. On the other hand, those that are comfortable with a lack of structure, who are comfortable with the notion of uncertainty and incertitude, will find this a very rich realm, a great landscape to research in. So the other issue there is with qualitative research is that it is non-numeric, unlike quantitative research, which has a tremendous number of numbers and data, charts, pie charts, fish diagrams, graphs, etc. What you're going to find in qualitative research is none of that. So again, if you come from a very quantitative mindset, you're going to frustrate yourself doing qualitative research because you're not going to find any of that. On the other hand, are you comfortable listening to evocative descriptions and discursive accounts shared by study participants? A lot of times in qualitative research, the researcher is doing a tremendous amount of listening. As a matter of fact, you're spending about 80% of the interview time listening to the accounts that are being shared with you by study participants. So the accounts can be very disjointed sometimes. They're very evocative, discursive, that is rambling. People will go on and on and on. They're telling you a story. And your role as a researcher is to listen, but on the other hand, your primary objective is to collect rich data. And if you get too caught up in that emotional string in the interview, you can lose sight of the fact that you have to at some point complete this interview. So how does one balance the time? Balance the time between objectivity and subjectivity, because you also know that qualitative interviewing can be a very intersubjective process where you're impacting and also being impacted by the stories and narratives that are being shared with you. So are you also able to work patiently with a lack of structure and procedures? I just said it a little while ago. If you're not comfortable doing that, you really ought to be thinking or rethinking this whole thing. So let me go to the next slide. It has a very convoluted nature. Qualitative research is typical in that, it seems very disorganized. It seems very disjointed at times. And yet there are some common threads that are running through, which we call emergent themes. As a researcher, it is your job to be able to discern those themes from the other data that is coming through the interviews, which can become extraneous to the interview. So when you're dealing with qualitative data, the researcher is typically working with a participant's thoughts, feelings, emotions, and perceptions as they relate to the study phenomena. So unlike quantitative research, where you're dealing with numbers and numeric data, in qualitative research, you're dealing with thoughts, feelings, emotions, and perceptions of the participants. Okay, they're going to be sharing what they feel, how they make meaning of something, how they make sense of something, and that can feel quite overwhelming, because you're going to have, with the feelings, you're going to have a lot of deep emotions, their thoughts on something, their perceptions, and it can get really heated also at times, especially when you're dealing with someone's emotions. Unlike quantitative studies, the volume of data can be enormous. So just to give you an example, if you're doing 13 or 14 qualitative interviews, semi-structured, in-depth, you're very likely to have about 350 to 375 pages of data. These are transcripts that at some point you'll have to transcribe and analyze. So the data can be overwhelming, to say the least. Data can contain numerous overlapping ideas. There's a lot of umbrigation that's going on there, kind of like overlapping tiles on a roof, okay? So there can be a lot of overlapping ideas, some of which may appear contradictory to the researcher, who is then tasked with making sense of something that is so ambiguous and abstract. It's all ambiguous and very, very abstract. So how do you then make sense of something that is not easy to make sense of, to put it mildly? There is no preset roadmap or a boilerplate to fall back on. There's the inherent lack of structure, which I talked about, and it can be really problematic. So let's go to the next slide. Who leads the qualitative research study? So rather than a researcher leading the study, which is quite often the case when you're doing or pursuing positive science, positivist scientists are typically hands-off observers, because the philosophy in quantitative research is that the researcher has to be far removed from the person that you're researching. And we call them the respondents there. So the idea is that if the researcher puts his or her own spin on that, it would corrupt the study, in a manner of speaking. So what the researcher tries to do is takes a very hands-off role, okay? Now, you got to understand that in qualitative research, it's actually quite the opposite. The researcher typically takes a hands-on role. And while in quantitative research, there's a lot of objectivity, in qualitative research, you'll find that there's a great deal of subjectivity. So this may be a very troublesome notion to a researcher who's not comfortable with not knowing how to handle this data, how to make sense of this data. And one very interesting thing that new researchers find is when they're doing the interviews and collecting data, someone might ask them to see how they are being led by the data. Where is the data leading you? Where is it taking you? So it's a weird notion for someone, because in research, one would think that you're the leader, you're the researcher, you're guiding, you're basically taking the research from A to Z. You're developing the roadmap, you're doing all the work. So as you will see in some subsequent slides, that in qualitative research, you're actually a co-creator of knowledge. So let me go to the next slide. And not only are you a co-creator of knowledge with the participant, you also share a paradoxically bilateral relationship with the participant. So what do we mean by a paradoxically bilateral relationship? Unlike quantitative research, where the researcher assumes a hands-off, distant relationship with the respondent, a qualitative researcher takes on an active role in creating this knowledge. So you are not only impacting the research, but you're also being impacted by the research, by the interviews, by what people tell you. And even though you are taking the role of an observer for the most part and a great listener, you are impacting the study, and the study is being impacted by you. So when the researcher's skill lies in maintaining objectivity and allowing participants to freely express themselves while eliciting thick data meaning deeply emotional, rich data. When you're trying to elicit rich data, all right, you're in the weeds with the participant. You're working together. You're in the trenches with the participant, believe it or not. You're not there as being a silent spectator or a total observer, like a fly on the wall, seeing whatever the interview is coughing up. What you're really doing is you're getting involved. You roll up your sleeves, you get involved in that interview process. So now one might say, okay, so if I'm getting involved in the interview process, am I not intruding, directing, or otherwise manipulating the participants? No, you're not. And that's where the skill lies, because whereas you engage with the process, as you engage with the participants, what you're doing is artfully allowing the space to emerge where they are open, they meaning the participants are open to expressing their thoughts, feelings, and emotions with you. And likewise, you have the space to also move in and steer the interview, especially when you're seeing that it's getting off the tracks, off the rails. Because oftentimes in interviews of this nature, in qualitative studies, people will go on and on and on and tell you about their stories, and you can get caught in the minutiae of all that. But what you have to realize is that as a researcher, what is your primary job? Your primary job is to collect really rich data, and enough data that sheds light on the study phenomena. Keep in mind that you're doing this study in order to understand the essence of a phenomena, understand what the phenomena really means. How do people make sense of something? How do you make sense of how they make sense of something, which we call the double hermeneutic. So this is a very alien and troublesome concept to quantitative scientists, because typically what might happen in quantitative studies is you send out 300 questionnaires and you get the, let's say you get 160, 180, 190 questionnaires back with responses that you're sitting down and analyzing those responses, but nowhere in this picture are you coming face to face or interacting with the respondents. And in qualitative research, from the time you start collecting data to actually the analysis of the data, you are actively engaged in the process. As a matter of fact, it's not uncommon at the data analysis stage for a researcher to go back to the participant and ask a participant if whatever she or he had said is exactly what you think they mean, because you don't want to put your own spin on their data, on what they shared with you. So you have to go back and ask them this question. Look, Tom, you shared with me something that I got your permission to share in my dissertation. However, before I do that, and before I go to the analytic phase, I needed to know if this is what you meant. And Tom might come back to you and say, no, this is not what I meant. I really meant to say this. So you see where I'm going with this? So it's very, very important to understand that there's a co-creation, all right? You have to know when to move in, you have to know when to back off in the interview. But the objective is to get good, solid data. Because without good, solid, thick data, you're not going to be able to do a really robust analysis. So let's go to the next slide. Researcher reflexivity. Now, this is a concept which you will typically find in qualitative studies only. All right. So qualitative research involves data that has been collected by a researcher who fully acknowledges that the data may have been impacted by the researcher's own ideas, thoughts, and biases. This is pretty much in line with a paradoxically bilateral relationship. So your ideas, your thoughts, your biases, your perceptions, and framework may already have some impact, some influence on this study. So you might ask, wait, if as a researcher, your thoughts and ideas are having an influence on the study, what's happening to the study then? Is the study about you? Is the study about the participant? Is the study about the participant's thoughts, feelings, and emotions? What is it? So if you're going to be having your own ideas and biases, don't you think that it can, to a point, impact the study adversely? By that I mean, even though what you're thinking, feeling, your biases are also data to be considered. But this data has to be set aside so that your biases have to be bracketed. They put in a bracket and set aside so that when you go ahead and conduct this study, you are consciously avoiding your own spin on it. You're allowing the phenomena to emerge. You're just being there as someone who is taking the notes, and recording the data, or recording the conversations. And even though as you're collecting the data, you might feel, so I'm talking about the phenomena of abuse, and I have a lot of feelings around this. So what the heck is this participant telling me? You know, I don't think what this participant is telling me is true. So it triggers certain responses in you as people are sharing their stories and narratives with you. You have to be able to make a note of these responses, what's triggering inside you, because this will be data that you will reveal, hopefully in the chapter 5, findings, discussion, etc. That's your final chapter of the dissertation. But this data, for the purpose of the data collection and data analysis, especially for the data collection, you have to be able to bracket this, because these are interferences. And like I said before, they're considered data, but they're not data that you want to see getting or infiltrating your data collection phase. So you want the participant stories to be as objective as possible. And you keep aside this stuff, which you will be revisiting at some point down the road as you get into your dissertation stage. Reflexivity that involves a subjective process of self-consciousness. So what is this self-consciousness? The researcher is conscious of how the study is impacting him. He or she is already going through a hermeneutic process, a process of interpretation, a process of meaning making, a process of sense making. And so you're conscious, very alert to what is happening in the research. All right. And through a process of self-reflection, you're making sense of all this, and yet you're allowing the participants to freely express themselves. And this is where the skill lies, and the skill is the refrain on the part of the researcher. So the refrain meaning you keep yourself back, you hold yourself back from adding your own 2 cents to the conversation, or to say to the participant who's talking about a phenomena, and you say, "Oh, is this what you mean?" Or isn't that what you were trying to say? So by doing that, you're leading the researcher or leading the participant into a direction that the participant may or may not be wanting to go in. All right. So you are not doing service to the research process there. So let's go to the next slide. All this raises some very important questions. And the questions are: when is qualitative research appropriate? What kind of research questions does it answer? What kind of data does it produce? And how do we go about interpreting such data? Because you can go through 15 or 20 interviews and collect 365 or 380 pages of transcripts, then what do you do with all this data? You have to be able to analyze the data. You have to be able to see what themes are emerging, how the dots are connecting, what are the convergences, what are the divergences that are occurring in the study. So you have to be able to make sense of that. And that can be a very involved, it can be a very intricate process for any researcher, and especially novice researchers, who I would definitely advise that they should seek the help of somebody, like it could be a faculty member, it could be another graduate, somebody that can take a look at your data and try to help you make sense of that. Of course, there are issues of confidentiality. If you have signed a confidentiality agreement with the participants, you may not be able to share the data per se, the interviews or the transcripts with someone who's not authorized. But you can certainly talk to that person in a very generic way and ask them for some advice on how they went about collecting the data and analyzing the data and making sense of it, and then finally writing about it. So definitely go out there and seek help. Okay, try not to do it alone, because this can be a challenging process, to say the least. Let's define qualitative research. So now I could have put this slide first, okay, but I wanted something to emerge from the previous slides so that this would probably make sense to you. Qualitative research is a scientific method of observation to gather non-numeric data. A lot of times people think that in qualitative research, everything is so abstract, everything's so disjointed, so unstructured. Where is the process? Where is the procedure? Where is the methodology? How do you go about doing something? Do you just interview people, throw enough spaghetti on the wall, hopefully some of it will stick and you can make sense of it and write about it? No, there is a procedure, let me put it this way: there is a process for doing the research, okay? And that's where the rigor that most people think is lacking in qualitative research comes up. The rigor in qualitative research is, how do you go about as a researcher and create a method? Within that methodology, create a method, create an approach on how you're going to be able to analyze the data. And that is a challenging thing, my friends. So the type of researcher or the type of research refers to the meanings, concepts, definitions, characteristics, metaphors, symbols, and description of things rather than their counts or measures. It deals with thoughts, opinions, perceptions, and emotions of participants as they make sense of a study phenomenon. So you can see that this is a whole smorgasbord. It's a whole new way of looking at research, versus quantitative, where you send out questionnaires and you get back the questionnaires and you look at the questions. That's your data. So all you're doing is looking through that data and trying to make sense, trying to connect the dots. But it's far more difficult in qualitative research to do that. And that is why qualitative research does not attract too many scholars, okay? Because they're not comfortable working with this. They'd rather go and be in the quantitative realm, where everything is laid out for you. All the procedures, a set roadmap is laid out for them. So qualitative research methods, when applied to social sciences, best study the why and how of human experience. Now remember, qualitative research is deeply about the human experience. In quantitative studies, you're looking at scales. You're looking at, 1 to 10, where do you see yourself? 3, 4, 5, 6, or if you're looking for happiness, how happy are you today? Okay. 1 being the least, 10 being the most. That is not the way we go about in qualitative research. In qualitative research, you go really deep and understand why something is happening and how something is happening as it relates to the human experience. So it's a human science approach, okay? Um, as opposed to when, where, or who, which is what you're going to be dealing with in mostly in quantitative research. All right. So those things are not as important as the why and how of human experience. So just remember that. Qualitative research questions. Now, there are a variety of qualitative research methods and designs available to the researcher. These are driven by the research questions. As you well know, when you're attempting to undertake a research study, you'll have a lot of thoughts about the phenomena that you want to research, a lot of feelings around the phenomena that you're going to research. And sometimes people fall prey into, looking at or studying or directing their minds to a research methodology because they're so anxious to find some methodology because that's going to be the anchor for their entire study. Yes, that is true. But before you go ahead looking for a methodology, looking for an approach on how to go about researching, you are required to think about your research question. So why do you want to research something? What is it that you want to research? All right. And what does it say to you? What is it? Why is it so compelling to you? Why is this research question keeping you awake at night? All right. And is this research question even researchable? Right. So you have to have some understanding that whatever you're trying to research has to be within the realm of possibility, that there's some literature available on it, that at least as a point of departure, you can start reviewing that literature. So a research question is very, very critical. Okay, it's very important to understand what it is that you're after. Okay, and the question should be crisp. The question should be clear. The question should hopefully contain the phenomena that you're trying to research. Okay, so for instance, what is it like for an engaged employee working in a predominantly virtual organization to work with a dispersed team? All right. So we know that we're talking about employee engagement here, but we also have a context here of virtuality, of a virtual team. So, be very mindful about what it is that you're trying to research. Is this research question researchable? Am I writing three lines, 4 lines, 5 lines, and making up a research question? Don't just go ahead and make up something. It doesn't matter if your research question is just one crisp sentence. That's okay. As long as the sentence is substantive, as long as it has some substance. All right. So with that, I want to go to the next point, which is depending upon the way a question is framed, we could be looking at different qualitative research methods. So as you well know, so it's not that you first get the method down and then you find the study design, and then when the faculty member asks you, hey, what's your research question? Oh, I haven't even thought about the research question yet. I'm still thinking about, Dr. Smith, I'm still thinking about the research methodology. Well, wait a second. Why have you gotten to the methodology part yet without even ascertaining your research question? So understand what is your research question first. And then the research question should be able to guide you into what kind of methodology is best suited to answer that research question. And within that methodology, you may have 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 different approaches. And what methodology, what approach, what study design would be best suited to answer your question. So these are some of the things that you have to deliberate. So seek some help, talk to your faculty members, and they should be very helpful to you in determining this. This is not an easy exercise. Believe it or not, there are times when people start their PhDs and they're doing the coursework and all the foundational Ks and everything else, the knowledge areas. And they could be spending about a year trying to figure out what their research question is. So it can take that long, so don't be scared, all right? Go with the flow, go with the process. That's how long a research question can take. Sometimes you can get it in a flash, but you really have to be able to think and try to understand, is this research question something that is worth spending time on, all right? Because this is going to take up your life. Everything else that you do in the study is going to revolve around the research question. So what you're seeing here is, I've sort of like drawn up a diagram here, a chart here, with some rows and columns. If you look at the example of a research question, RQ is the research question. The second column is the key features. The third column is the suitable approach. So let's look at the first research question. What are the main experiential features of being abused? What are the main experiential features of being abused? So if you notice in the next column, the emphasis on the common structure of abuse, albeit indirectly experienced by a participant. So when you're setting up this question, what are the main experiential features of being abused? You're not necessarily going after people who have experienced the abuse as a lived experience per se. So it's okay if you have a participant group that you recruit for this study, and they can reflect on what it's like to be abused. Anyone, as a matter of fact, can reflect on what it is like to be abused. Okay, now they're not necessarily talking from their own personal standpoint, but they've all heard of what abuse does, the impact that abuse has on people, emotionally, physiologically, psychologically. So they're able to talk about something without actually having experienced that something. Or in some cases, it could be the abuse that a spouse is going through at the hands of a boss, all right? And the spouse's wife is hearing about this abuse, right? She's trying to make sense of this abuse because he comes back and he shares with his wife whatever's happening at work, how he's being emotionally abused by a boss or a supervisor. So she's having an indirect experience of abuse. So if you recruit her as a participant, she can talk about that abuse as she hears it, as she views it through the lens of her husband. Okay. So likewise, people that, about an earthquake. So if you talk about, what is it like to experience your first earthquake, you can have people who can talk about their experience, their personal experiences of the whole house shaking and everything, the trees shaking, everything shaking. But this is their own personal experience, is their lived experience. So let's not confuse the lived experience with the indirect experience of a participant. So let's look at the suitable approach. Phenomenology may be deployed to answer this question. So this is an example of thatness. You'll hear the expressions thatness and whatness. Whatness is very ontological. Thatness is sort of indirectly. So phenomenology will be deployed to answer this question. This is an example of thatness. The participant may not have had a lived experience of the phenomena of abuse. So even though the question is asking about abuse, abuse being the phenomena that you're studying. You're studying this phenomena indirectly, not by folks that have experienced this, but by others that can say something about it through their own experiences, through the stories and the narratives and social media and news that they've been hearing on that. Let's look at the second research question. How does someone who has lived with abuse make sense of it? How does someone who has lived with abuse make sense of this? If you notice here, when I'm asking this question, I would like to recruit participants that have actually experienced this kind of abuse. They've had a direct lived experience of abuse. Or, you might ask, what is it like to be gay? What is it like to be marginalized in an LGBTQ community? Okay. So clearly, when you're recruiting participants for that kind of study, you're recruiting folks that can authoritatively and sincerely talk about their experiences of marginalization or abuse or alienation and things of that nature. So the process is what we're trying to do as a researcher is you're asking them to make meaning of something. So it's a meaning making and a sense making process. How do you make sense of something? And how do you make meaning? So the same question could be framed, how do you make sense of the abuse that you experienced, as an example? Or how do you make sense of what is happening currently in the political environment? Okay. This person is trying to make sense of something, but when you ask that question, how do you make sense of the political environment? And if you're doing this, if you're asking this person to make sense of the political environment as a direct lived experience, all right, you would necessarily have to recruit a participant who is, maybe a representative of Congress or part of the Senate or other folks that are involved with this political process. It would not make sense to have a participant, who is just reading the newspapers, reading or listening to CNN and making sense of what's happening in the political environment. So when you really want to get down to the lived experience, you have to recruit folks that can actually help you make meaning and help you make sense of that phenomena up close. And remember, the thing is that we're talking up close, not per se, not as such meaning indirectly. You're talking about a direct lived experience. So the research question may best be answered using the interpretative phenomenological approach, also known as IPA. The IPA approach was developed by a group of health psychologists led by Dr. Jonathan Smith at the University of Birkbeck in California. I'm sorry, University of Birkbeck in UK. Currently, hundreds of studies, full-length dissertations, etc., have been done using the IPA approach. It's a turnkey process to understanding phenomenological questions and pursuing phenomenological data, or making sense of that and analyzing phenomenological data. The third and last one is what factors influence how people manage abuse. Now, if you notice in the first two scenarios, we're talking about abuse. The first one, main experiential features of being abused, and then talking about how someone has lived with abuse. So we are really discussing the phenomena of abuse. In the third case also, what factors influence how people manage abuse? We're again looking for participants to shed light on abuse, but here we are looking for something different. Please notice carefully that we're looking for the factors that influence. We're looking for a causality. This causes this, or as a result of this, this happens. All right. So if you notice the emphasis on explanation and causality, the factors, the impacts, the influences, etc. You know, I'm sure you know that we're talking here about grounded theory. Grounded theory and phenomenology are both inductive approaches, very popular inductive approaches within the qualitative realm. Okay. And before I move on to the next slide, I want to give credit to Dr. Catherine Kinmon at Manchester Metropolitan University. This has been excerpted from her PowerPoint presentation on IPA, on the interpretive phenomenological analysis. So thank you, Catherine, for sharing your work with us. Oh, the oddities and vagaries of qualitative research. You will observe that even though the phenomena of abuse remains the same, and I'm talking about what we just discussed in the last slide, even though the phenomena of abuse remains the same in all research questions, each question points the research in a different direction using different methodologies. So even though we were still talking about abuse in all three scenarios, we are using a different methodology because there's a different methodology that can best answer that question, the way we craft that question. So by phrasing and rephrasing and restructuring the question, we end up using different methodologies, different designs, etc. Each outcome may also be different depending on what the research study is seeking to accomplish. So again, the end product may be different, using different approaches, different methodologies. Unlike quantitative research, where the data collected is numeric and highly objective, the data collected and analyzed in qualitative research is highly subjective. This data, folks, is very subjective data. It's got thoughts, feelings, perceptions, emotions, how people make sense of something, all right? So it's not about the Likert scale, or it's not about graphs and charts. It is certainly not for someone who's unable to tolerate uncertainty and ambiguity. We already talked about that. A skillful qualitative researcher does not begin the study with the final outcome in mind. He or she remains a bit speculative and tentative. You're open to surprise. So remember one thing, that in qualitative research, where you start and where you end up may be quite different positions, because it can take you in many different directions as you delve into this study, because there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of speculation. So the verbiage that you generally use when you're working with qualitative studies is, this is how you speculate on something. You don't say, this is what it's going to be, or this is what I know it's going to be based on the data. It could be just your intuition. It could be just your thinking on something, how you're making sense of something, but it's not definitive. It's not certain. All right. It remains open to surprise. It remains open to whatever might emerge out of that. You're also willing to change course midway through the research, if in fact the data is leading elsewhere. So if the data, remember in the previous slide, we were talking about who leads the research in a qualitative study. It can sometimes be that the data is leading us somewhere, all right? So you have to be open to be led by the data and be able to change course midway. So if you really start to collect the data and you find that this is going in a very different direction that you expected, you may need to make a mid-course correction there. All right. So just remember that, and that's the huge difference between quantitative and qualitative studies. My final thoughts, I'd like to conclude here by saying that there is a great deal of variety and range of approaches within the realm of qualitative research, such as phenomenology, grounded theory, case study method, ethnography, ethnomethodology, action research, etc. The researcher is advised to use caution before embarking on a specific methodology. Please give yourself plenty of time to think through the research question, to try to gain an understanding through the literature on whether that question has already been asked a lot of times, or are you really trying to discover something new? It's okay if you have a research question that has already been attempted and researched by others. That's fine. You're not trying to be another Einstein, another Newton, okay? Every person that does research is adding to the existing body of knowledge. So nobody's going out there reinventing the wheel, in a manner of speaking. When I did my research on negative capability was an expression that was coined by the famous English romantic poet John Keats in 1817. Now, nobody had done a full-length research study on negative capability because it was an aesthetic concept. It was from literature. It was from poetry. So I contributed something from the standpoint of negative capability, but applied it, extrapolated it to the study of leadership. So I contributed something additional to what was already there. And you will do the same as you look for research phenomena and research studies to go with. Do not fall in love with the methodology and then go looking for a research question. I already talked about that, so I'm not going to beat it into the ground. Spend a great deal of time thinking about the research question. We already discussed that. Narrow it down to 1 or 2 sentences at the most. A lot of times people think that if their research question is running into one whole paragraph, they've done a phenomenal job. They're going to go out there and dazzle their faculty members, dazzle their mentors. That is so far from the truth. You really have to have a research question that is precise. It is short, yet it encompasses a lot. All right, and that's where your skill lies. Is your research question something that sums up when somebody reads it? For instance, my research question was, for my doctoral studies, what was it like for leaders to be in a negative capability frame of mind in the workplace during moments of conflict and unrest? So, as you can see, I've already got negative capability as my phenomena front and center inside the research question, but it's not a 5-line research question. It's a short question, but and I'm also giving you the context there. All right, in a workplace that is going through periods of unrest and conflict. So you get the drift of that. Narrow it down to 1 or 2 sentences. Make sure that your question is researchable and contains the phenomena. I already talked about that. Resist the temptation to rush to an outcome before it is even achieved. Certain approaches, such as phenomenology, do not seek an outcome. You may only have certain findings to report. Let me just talk real quickly about phenomenology. A lot of folks think that phenomenological studies should be approached the way everything else is approached. Phenomenology is a different animal altogether. There's a lot of active voice when you're writing phenomenological studies. So, you use the first person. I did this, or I did that, or I assumed. So you're speaking in the first person. And you're going to run into situations where you're, and I ran into the same challenge with my mentor. My mentor asked me, hey, why is it that you're writing so much in the first person? Why can't you put it in the third person? The researcher did this, or the researcher came to this understanding. The reason for that is when you're doing a qualitative study, the readers of your study, the ones that will be looking at your research, not your faculty, not your mentor, but the others that will be studying your research at some point down the road. They want to know what happened to you. Where was your researcher reflexivity? Where were your experiences? What did you assume as you were doing the study? And at the end of the study, were your assumptions correct, incorrect? And how did those assumptions play a role? Did they impact the study phenomena? Did they impact your interviewing process? Were you able to successfully bracket what you said you're going to be bracketing? So things of that nature. So understand that phenomenology writing is critical because it has to have an active voice and should be typically done in the first person. Of course, there are certain chapters, like chapter 2, the literature review, where you're citing from others' work, where clearly you're going to be talking in the third person. And also in the analysis part, you may have other citations that come in from the extant literature in phenomenology. But your phenomenological writing must contain an active voice and must be in the first person. I cannot overemphasize that enough. And I'm currently working with some students who are questioning me about that, and they're finding a hard time understanding why it has to be written in the first person, because it's not considered fashionable, in a manner of speaking, to be writing in the first person. It's, people start thinking about it as too colloquial. Okay, it is not. Just remember that. All right, so let's go to the next slide. That's the final slide. My thanks to Catherine Kinmon, Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis, her PowerPoint presentation. Also to Michael J. Pratt for the lack of a boilerplate tips on writing up and reviewing qualitative research. Those are the two references that I used. My contact information, if you want to note down, is abehal@email.fielding.edu. Again, for those of you that are not able to read it, abehal@email.fielding.edu. I'm going to be uploading this presentation to my YouTube channel, where just about a week ago, I uploaded another presentation which had to do with the use of IPA in qualitative data analysis. So you can check out my presentation there. That's an hour-long presentation. And I think you'll find it helpful if you're going to be thinking about using IPA, the interpretative phenomenological analysis. All right, so with that, I want to thank you for your time and attention. And if you want a copy of this entire presentation, this PowerPoint, please email me, and I'd be very happy to send it to you ASAP. Okay, take care. Bye-bye now.